Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the closing plenary of the Pre-COP26 Knowledge Exchange Dialogue for Climate, Nature, and People, hosted by CIFAL York with our partners. I am Idil Boran, Associate Professor and Associate Director of CIFAL York at York University in Canada. CIFAL York is a center for cross-sectoral leadership training and knowledge transfer affiliated with the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR. At York University, we are located on traditional land, and it precedes the establishment of the university. The area is known as Takaranto and has been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. The current treaty holders are the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, a treaty to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Acknowledging the land has been important to us as we opened our event and now as we open our closing panel in order to punctuate our two-day knowledge exchange. It has been important to acknowledge the land because we have a mandate to work on research and outreach for accelerated action on biodiversity and climate change aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I am very honored to have had the opportunity to have such a great discussion with a dynamic and distinguished line of participants in the last 2 days, yesterday and today. I acknowledge our event partners at York University, York International, the UNESCO Chair in Reorienting Education Towards Sustainability, the Synergies of Planetary Health Research Initiative, which receives funding from the Dadele Institute for Global Health Research, the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, and the Shirk Exchange Knowledge Mobilization Fund. Our international partners are the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment at Imperial College in London, and the German Development Institute based in Bonn in Germany. We have a great panel for you today and a fantastic line of speakers. To give you a snapshot of our sleep speakers, we have Catherine Cole from our partnering organization from within York University, the UNESCO Chair in Reorienting Education Towards Sustainability. Our faculty member at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University, Professor Deborah McGregor. Professor Dr. Imme Scholz, Deputy Director of the German Development Institute. Professor William Cheung, Director and Professor of the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries at the University of British Columbia. And last but not least, Natalie Petorelli from the Zoological Society of London. I am going to introduce all our panelists in more detail as we welcome them into the podium. For some housekeeping, I welcome all our participants to put comments in the chat box. And after a short presentation by our panelists, we are going to have a brief Q&A. Without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce Catherine Cole, who is joining us from the UNESCO Chair in Reorienting Education Towards Sustainability. Welcome, Catherine. Catherine, you are the focal point for the SDG 4 Quality Education at the Higher Education and Research for Sustainable Development Global Cluster International Association of the Universities. And you are executive coordinator of the UNESCO Chair here at York University. It is a pleasure to have you to give us a context and a vision for our panel. Thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Well, thank you, Edel from York University in New CIFAL for allowing me to set the scene. And thanks to the entire York team and all the other partners in the last couple of days for bringing together the expertise from various knowledge and belief systems, but also from cultures on the issues of climate, nature, and people. This dialogue, to me, has once more shown the potential of higher education and research institutions to create ideas for real climate action in a transdisciplinary but also transnational approach when respectfully changing perspectives and underline them with evidence-based knowledge. With highlighting indigenous perspectives, we also aim at enhancing a meaningful climate action on the policy, but also on the practical level. While the public focus these days is on the upcoming COP26, the results from this dialogue are also serving the ongoing COP15 on biodiversity, and most of all, the overarching 2030 agenda with the SDGs as a vision of all UN member states for peace and sustainable development. As academics, it is our challenge not only to tackle and change the current wrongdoing, but also to follow this overall vision of a peaceful, just, and sustainable society, and to develop a positive narrative. How do we imagine and promote such a sustainable future that we don't quite understand yet by creating more than a list of exclusions of what we know today and don't want any longer? Therefore, we need all academic disciplines equally involved and have our institutions to live up to our own expectations of changing the minds, but not the climate, and teaching our students to become educated graduates in a more than ever fast-paced, changing, and uncertain environment. We can provide research, but also translate our research into public and policy language and make the knowledge widely accessible. We can support people in dealing with the actual dilemmas of the wicked sustainability issues and not being able to solve the 17 SDGs or other pressing sustainability themes, sometimes even having to balance or make choices for goals, knowing that this might have negative effects on others. Higher education and research can open up towards serving the local and the global community and help holding stakeholders responsible, including higher education itself, for our commitments to climate action. All in all, we can model sustainability throughout our own institutions and mindsets and show how responsible action does not only impose restrictions, but can create new opportunity. Higher education has always been at the forefront of sustainable development, but seldom sat at the actual negotiation table. Now, from my perspective, it is time to move further. We have been accepted into a serving role for policy with our knowledge. As climate change is becoming the most urgent issue, higher education can assume a policy influencing role and proactively define the way ahead in an ethical but also equitable way. The last 2 days can be seen as a positive move into this direction. Thank you again, and I look forward to listening to the perspectives of our panelists today.
Thank you, Katrin. It is greatly appreciated to put this context and to give meaning to our discussion. I am now very pleased to introduce you to my colleague, Deborah McGregor, here at York University. Deborah is joining us from the Osgoode Hall Law Faculty. And welcome, Deborah. Let me take a second to introduce you. You are with the Osgoode Hall Law Faculty, as well as cross-appointed with the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. Deborah, you are an expert in Indigenous knowledge systems and environmental justice. Please share your takeaways for strengthening biodiversity and climate alignment and why Indigenous knowledge systems are central. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for the opening. Well, I guess good news for York University is the newly established Centre for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages, because that'll be key, I think, in a lot of this work moving forward. So hoping to work with many of you, and I'm the inaugural director. And we can just see why knowledges and languages is really important as part of advancing biodiversity, supporting people, and addressing the challenges of climate change that everybody faces, including the planet. So there's a few things I noted. I'm kind of old school. I still have my paper notes. Is that what I call assumptions? It's like, what is it about Indigenous peoples and their contributions? In my mind, in the work that I've done for decades, it's almost impossible to protect and engage with Indigenous knowledges without recognizing people. You wouldn't believe how many people I work with who think I just want knowledge and don't really want to address like the people kind of issues like colonialism and structural inequities. So Indigenous peoples actually need to be supported and protected, and their rights as well. And that enables the flourishment and transformation of Indigenous knowledges that can contribute to the challenges that we're all facing. So that needs to be acknowledged. The second aspect in my mind that needs to be acknowledged, and a starting point that I come from, is that Indigenous peoples and the land acknowledgement was given, is Indigenous peoples have been here for thousands of years and have knowledge of places and the territories. And here we are, we're still here. So we know how to work through major challenges through our knowledge systems and legal systems, and contribute to sustainability goals. But we're also full societies. We're not just populations for people to study and to deal with. We're actually peoples and societies who also want to make climate change decisions. And Indigenous peoples in Canada find themselves in a lot of cases contributing to other people's, usually the state's assessments and solutions, but we really haven't had the ability oftentimes to develop our own and need the support to do that. So I think we're kind of in a place where that's important. So why are our knowledges and languages important? So probably I'm starting to see it more so than in the past, is the recognition that while Indigenous peoples only make up 5% of the world's population, they speak majority of the 7,000 languages and own occupy or resources of 22% of the global land area. And this is where 80% of the world's biodiversity is. So whatever it is that Indigenous peoples are doing in terms of caretaking of the land and biodiversity based on Indigenous knowledges and languages and our own legal systems is going to be really critical in moving forward. So there's a lot to learn from Indigenous peoples. It also points to the importance of language, which in my work, Indigenous communities have always said, but you don't often see that discussed in a lot of conventional climate change discussions, at least in a lot of the circles that I'm in, but it's always comes up in Indigenous. And this also points to why colonialism needs to be discussed directly in relation to Indigenous peoples' biodiversity and climate change, because those colonial forces, historical and ongoing, structural inequalities undermine Indigenous languages and way of life and knowledges. So that needs to be addressed in order for Indigenous peoples to continue to flourish and contribute to the world's biodiversity and climate solutions. So what does this mean in terms of moving forward? So I'm really limited in terms of how I kind of understand a lot of the bigger problems or experience them, is recognition of Indigenous climate leadership. And Canada has this actually in its climate change policies, but hasn't figured quite yet how to go from the rhetoric to meaningful. And essentially, I did a scan across the country in terms of Indigenous development of strategies and plans. And public, there might be some that I haven't been able to find because they're not public yet. And there's only the Inuit to Pirsit Kami that have a strategy. Assembly of First Nations is in the process of developing one, and the BC First Nations. So this means that Indigenous peoples are not being supported yet to utilize their own knowledges and generate Indigenous climate knowledge that can contribute to their own communities and decision making, and also to be shared more broadly, because people are interested in Indigenous knowledges often don't talk about languages, but the two of them are very much related. So there really needs to be support for Indigenous climate governance, and we're not anywhere near where that needs to be. So what is climate leadership? What can that look like in the context that we find ourselves in? That's already been presented. So Canada's Climate Science Report 2050 points to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous leadership, and recognizes that Indigenous people need to be able to lead their own research, ask their own questions, as opposed to just participating in others. And that's important. I would never say that's not important. It's just not enough in order to be able, again, to support communities that I've stated before, want to make their own good climate decisions. They're their own societies, have their own way of life that they also want to protect on their own terms. It doesn't mean people don't want to contribute. They do, absolutely. Believe me, a lot of elders and folks I work with just saying, if only people would listen to us. So it's really important to be able to support Indigenous-led research and Indigenous knowledge being used as part of those processes, so that Indigenous people can self-determine their own, determine their own future. So there's a couple of principles in this report that are noteworthy that I'll share with you. One is that making space for Indigenous innovation in relation to climate knowledge as well is a benefit of Indigenous support for Indigenous intellectual spaces in the climate change realm, for lack of a better word. So, and how Indigenous knowledge can work with other knowledges. It's, like I said, if you start from the premise, like I do, that Indigenous peoples want to self-determine their future, and Indigenous peoples are societies and communities who want to make the best decisions possible, they also recognize we need to have other knowledges, Western science, but there hasn't really been, that hasn't really been equitable at this point. So part of this science agenda is, how do you bring in Indigenous knowledges and Western science together so the best decisions can be made? And different frameworks are being developed for that, ethical space framework, weaving Indigenous knowledge systems. So there's a lot of folks who are trying to work on this and make it a reality. The second principle is to support Indigenous self-determined research that respects Indigenous climate self-determined futures. Is the way that I'm putting it. Like we're facing this, and then, but how do we start to determine what our future is going to look like for future generations? So I guess I end with a call to support Indigenous peoples and their goals, and being able to generate their own Indigenous, unique, distinct climate knowledge that can contribute to their own communities, because again, they're caretaking some pretty important areas in the world, and in Canada too. Most of the species at risk are in First Nation communities. So we need to support Indigenous peoples and their rights in order to enable the sharing of Indigenous knowledges and languages to the broader community for the benefit of everyone, and actually for planetary health as well. So hopefully I was able to get through what I wanted in a short period of time, and thank you for listening to me, and look forward to hearing the rest of the panelists. So miigwech.
Miigwech. Deborah, it's been fantastic to hear your insights, especially the emphasis on Indigenous leadership. It's very inspiring, and I look forward to cross-pollinating these thoughts with our panelists. And on this note, I'm delighted to introduce Professor William Cheung, who is joining us from the University of British Columbia Institute for Oceans and Fisheries. William, thank you for joining in your early morning. And we are delighted. You are the a professor and director of the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries, and you're also a Canada Research Chair. You have worked extensively on the marine ecosystems and the interactions between marine, coastal, and health as well, and human systems. We are very privileged to have your insights, and based on your expertise, please highlight if possible with examples, the current state of vulnerabilities of marine human systems to global change. Thank you for your expertise. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to join this closing panel. Yeah, I think what I want to really bring up is the importance of bringing the oceans into all the discussions on climate and linking it to biodiversity, which is should be one of the key themes in the upcoming COP26 meeting. I'm going to share a few slides to help me explain some of the key points that I want to share with all of you. So let me do that. So the first point I want to bring up is that climate change is already affecting all parts of the oceans. This is based on the IPCC special reports for the oceans inquiry and the changing climate, which I'm one of the coordinating lead author. And this figure basically highlight that if you see the color that is on this table, it is actually showing that there are already detected changes related to climate change in the physical system, in the ecological system, as well as in different aspects of the ocean human systems. And this also happens in different ocean basins. And basically, most part of the ocean basins, we already detected these changes and can be attributed to climate change. The second thing that I want to highlight is that we are living in a world where it is not only climate change, but that other aspects of human activities are also affecting the biodiversity, both on land, freshwater, as well as the oceans. And some of the key drivers of this change include climate change, but then in the ocean, particularly overexploitation or direct exploitations has been a major threat and contributions to the loss of biodiversity in the oceans. Other things like changes in coastal habitats or ocean habitats, pollutions, invasive species, all are things that are already happening and that have contributed to the continuous loss of biodiversity in the past few decades. Another thing is that these human drivers interact with one another. It exacerbates the effects of climate change, but then at the same time, the effects of climate change also exacerbate these other human stresses. What it means is that we really need to take a holistic view in addressing these climate and biodiversity issues so that we can tackle the drivers of these societal challenges in both land and oceans holistically, and that there are also linkages between land, freshwater, and oceans. And all of these changes are closely related to the sustainability of the society. We already have lots of evidence that demonstrate the linkages between the oceans to different sustainable development goals. And what it means is that climate change and its interaction with other drivers are also hampering our ability to achieve the sustainable developments of the global societies. One of the key aspect of this is that these impacts are not felt and experienced equally across the world, and that's both on land as well as in the ocean. And I want to bring up the example, particularly for the oceans and the linkages to human health. And in this particular figure, it highlights that in the oceans, we are projecting to see that climate change is going to drive the decrease in fish stocks and potential fisheries catches, particularly in tropical ocean, as highlighted by the deep blue color. But then those countries that are felt most directly by this decrease, those coastal countries who are in the middle of these hotspots of impacts of climate change on fisheries, actually also those countries who are most dependent on fish stocks and fisheries for the supply of their micronutrients, such as zinc, omega-3 fatty acids, iron. And these are highlighted by the red color or orange color on land. And that's really unfortunate with that overlap. And if you also overlap the land-based climate threats, it really match up very, very closely also with the area where the oceans are projected to be most impacted. So it means that we need to also address these global disparities in impacts and the subsequent implication for sustainable development, particularly in the world that is most needed for this support from the ocean. And the oceans is not only the part of being affected, but then it will also be an important part of the oceans. And thus, the science policy linkages has a big role in trying to shape how we can develop these future desirable societies and natures with considerations of the oceans to help achieve our sustainable development goals for the world. And to do that, both science and linking science to policy would help us to identify what are the transformative changes that are needed and what are the policy levers that can actually steer us towards these transformative changes in order to help us to move into a futures of the oceans that are futures of the world that are desirable. And that world must include the oceans, because we know that ocean basically is an important part of our society. And we also recognize that this will be pluralistic, the view about what is desirable in the future. So it will differ between different communities. The indigenous communities will have their own views about what will be desirable for them compared to other people's other communities within the countries or across the world. So it is also important to recognize these priorities, trying to work with locally with the communities to recognize the local context, identify these transformative changes and policy levers, and then work on trying to then steer our world towards these futures. And that science will be and social sciences and other related research will be as well as indigenous knowledge will be a very important part and play an important role in informing us how we can what kind of pathway we should engage in and how we can engage in those pathways. And with that, I think that's basically what I hope to bring up with the importance of the status of the oceans and the climate change and how science and policies can actually help us to move into a desirable futures. Thank you.
Thank you, William. It's great to hear your insights, and indeed, it's been very, very important to have the oceans and coastal zones and the connection to human communities as part of the agenda, and very much appreciated. I am now moving to welcome Professor Dr. Imme Scholz. Hello, Imme. Welcome to our panel. I am delighted to introduce you. You are Deputy Director of the German Development Institute, and in fact, our partnering organization for this event. And I am delighted to have you here with us. And you have immense expertise. Between 2002 and 2009, you were head of the environment department at the German Development Institute, and since 2013 you have been member of the German Council for Sustainable Development. And in fact, I want to ask you a question based on that expertise, that specialization and experience that you have. Tell us, as an expert who has been working on sustainable development goals, what is the state right now and of progress, and what to look forward to in terms of the ambition and the opportunities and challenges to tackle. Imme, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Idil, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I have prepared some slides, and Annette, if you can show them, please. Yeah, it was incredibly interesting to listen to the previous speakers also for me, because I have been invited by the United Nations to lead or co-chair the independent group of scientists who are tasked with preparing a global sustainable development report to come out in 2023. And there, the question is exactly at what situation are we right now with the SDGs, and what can be done for accelerating progress. So I'm seeing that the slides are not working. I will try to upload it then to. Now it's coming. Yeah, great. Yeah, okay. So and that's why I'm using the template from the United Nations Independent Group of Scientists and not from DIE, from my institute. And what I thought is the title of your workshop, Multi-Level Action on Climate, People and Nature, that is really a good lens for looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, why they are important not only for making peace with nature, so for transforming the relationship between human society and nature, but also for recovering from COVID-19 pandemic in a transformative way. So let us look at the next slide, please. And the main thing of the pandemic has been that it has really thrown us back on the SDGs. But all of you probably know that anyway, we weren't on track for implementing, for reaching actually the goals which have been quantified globally and nationally for the various dimensions of change which are needed for making human prosperity sustainable, together with a stable situation in ecosystems and biodiversity. So on the graph you see here on the left side, this is how poverty has changed, the number of extreme poverty between 1992 and projections after the COVID pandemic. And what you can see here, if you are close enough to the screen, is that it is since 1992 the only years where we had an increase in extreme poverty were in the end of the 90s, when we had the Asian crisis. So the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009 did not increase poverty. It was a huge problem for banks, obviously, and it was a huge problem for many rich countries. But in total, globally, poverty still decreased those years. But now the projections are that we will have a massive increase in extreme poverty, because the financial crisis affected the financial markets and the financial system, but the COVID pandemic brought everything to a halt, and people felt it immediately in their day-to-day lives. And so this is a big throwback. And when we look at the resources countries have for dealing with the pandemic and for investing them in recovery, that is the graph to the right side, what it shows is that most of the fiscal stimulus packages are concentrated on the US, they're concentrated on Japan and on the EU. The Chinese stimulus package is smaller or equal to the EU's. So, and then, so this shows that the resources for dealing with the impact of the pandemic in the short term, social security systems, for example, are extremely concentrated in the rich countries. So this will exacerbate also the midterm and long-term effects. And the other risk, obviously, is that stimulus measures will be invested in recovery, in maintaining the structures, in making existing economies continue to work, but not in the transformation which we actually need in our energy systems, in our infrastructures, including both economic and social infrastructures. So the next slide shows another trend which we weren't aware of in 2015 when the SDGs were adopted, and this is the large number of net zero emission pledges we are seeing now. This is positive news, especially if the pledges are moved to legal commitments and then to real action. That is something which is not clear yet, but to have the pledges is in advance. But of course, and we know that combating climate change is absolutely fundamental for any other progress to be made in environmental and social terms. But of course, there is a risk that governments and societies will focus on this topic and will not look sufficiently at the linkages between climate neutrality and sustainable use of soils, sustainable food systems, or just economies, inclusive economies, and biodiversity loss. So because we have a tendency to be very much to focus on one thing in our decision making and in policy making, and not looking at the networked effects in positive and negative aspects regarding the many dimensions a just and sustainable society actually has. So that's what I want to show you in the next slide. Because previous speakers have mentioned, we are talking about, when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, we're talking about 17 areas of work. And usually in national strategies for sustainable development, these goals are addressed one by one. This is also the case in the German Sustainable Development Strategy. But actually, we know that these areas are all interlinked. You cannot think about health without safe drinking water, without gender equality, without knowledge and education or working infrastructures. So in the Global Sustainable Development, which had been published in 2019, what the scientists did then was to think of 6 areas where we need to make advances in an interconnected way, where we can group the 17 goals in a networked way so that we can address them together and look and use the synergies when addressing them together. And so they speak about human well-being. These are the vertical columns: human well-being and capabilities, sustainable and just economies, energy decarbonization with equitable access for everyone to energy, food systems and nutrition patterns, urban and peri-urban development, and the global environmental commons, which groups the climate, biodiversity, oceans here together. But the main thing here for thinking about change are the horizontal ones. So public institutions, public policies and laws, governance arrangements, inclusive decision-making, as Deborah was pointing out, economic and finance policies which promote change and not destruction, individual and collective action. So it's not only governments which have to act, but societies and individuals as well, and science and technology. So we know that 70% of all publications, research publications on climate change, come from the global north. So the majority of the population of the world is not participating in this knowledge production, which also limits, of course, the resources to define own futures and transition pathways towards sustainability locally. So this is the matrix in which we think we think that change has to be looked at, and where things can come together, where it is possible to think about protecting the climate, adapting to climate change, protecting biodiversity, and investing in people's futures in an inclusive way, different from today's way. And this is where we also look for input from society. And I think I will approach Deborah after this session to learn more from her, because we are very much concerned in integrating indigenous knowledges and ideas also in our report. So the last slide I wanted to share with you is not coming. It's actually from the IPBES report, but I don't know why it's, yeah, now it comes. And William also showed it. And here what I want to highlight is, you can see on the upper left side the drivers of change, the direct drivers and the indirect ones. And you can see the leverage points, which we could use for accelerating change and for making change possible. And the points I want to highlight here is the importance of values, of societal values, and the change of these values, because it's values which influence patterns of behavior, which have an influence on demographic change, on the technologies we choose or we discard, on our governance systems, how inclusive they are, how just they are, and how we deal with conflicts. And these levels of action are important for making sure that the trajectories we define democratically for change really are fit for purpose, so that the long-term effects are positive, that conflicts with other goals are being considered and taken care of. And we do not look only at solving these conflicts between goals at national level or local level, but at the same time at global level, and that we define our trajectories at national level in a way that they are a positive contribution globally and are not considered executed or designed in a way that they are detrimental for others. I think that is the largest challenge actually we're having ahead of us. And with that, I would like to conclude.
Thank you so much, Ime, for this very insightful presentation, and especially the emphasis you put on the interlinkages and the networked effects. This is exactly what we have been interested in this workshop, and you have provided a very good stock take on the importance of these interlinkages across the Sustainable Development Goals, and thank you. Now it is my pleasure to invite Nathalie Petorelli. Dr. Petorelli is a senior scientist at the Zoological Society of London, working in biodiversity monitoring and conservation. Nathalie, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here. And I really want to have your insights now as we close the closing plenary, because we're all getting ready to go to COP26. And you have an eminent and really impressive record of research on biodiversity, and in fact also specialize in monitoring and assessing progress. Now, as we are all getting ready, our working group, and I know the Zoological Society of London and the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment, we're all going to be there. Now, please, based on your expertise, share your insights and priorities as you see, as the world prepares for Glasgow, on the topic of aligning biodiversity with climate change goals. Nathalie, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Idil. Well, so let's start it from the common knowledge. We are not now really pretty sure that our environment is breaking down, and the scientific advice from both the IPCC and the IPBES could not be clearer. We need rapid, bold, and collective action to transition economy to a low-carbon, sustainable, biodiverse future. And now we have a number of crises on our hand, and some of the previous speakers were referring at it. But if we're looking at the two pertinent for that event, on one hand, we have a very well-known, well-communicated about climate change crisis, with a lot of political traction. And then we have the much less talked about, yet equally threatening biodiversity crisis. And these two are highly intertwined. Now, you would think that prioritizing action that jointly address both crises would be or should be a no-brainer. But I'd say it's not that simple, and there are uncertainties and difficulties associated with the implementation of those so-called nature-based solutions. First, there's a number of things that actually we don't know, and that may hinder the development of those integrated biodiversity and climate solutions. For example, these may relate to how climate change mitigation and adaptation approaches benefit biodiversity conservation. At this point in time, we don't really have a monitoring framework that enables the standardized quantification and comparison of biodiversity gains associated with nature-based solutions. There's also unknown that relate to our ability to track and predict ecosystem that may shift their distribution with climate change, or that face collapse because of climate change. Then we have something to learn about and improve our capacity on predicting the impact of climate change on the effectiveness of those nature-based solutions. A lot of the dialogue right now doesn't factor that in. The fact that you may implement something somewhere, but the effectiveness of this in 10 years might be completely different than right now. And then there's the problem of developing solutions that match the temporal, the spatial, and the functional scale of the challenges, as well as developing a comprehensive and practical framework for assessing and mitigating against the risk, ecological but also social, as we were discussing with some of the previous speakers, of those risks associated and posed by the implementation of nature-based solutions. So we have some scientific things that we don't know, and there's some scientific challenges, and then there's a bunch, I think, of systemic issues. So we have tended to deal with crises by creating conventions or frameworks that are in many cases not that joined up. So if we think about the two crises, the climate change and biodiversity one, they are generally dealt by two conventions and associated scientific panel, which have vastly different political weight and visibility, and don't interact as much as one hoped they would. So it's not clear who will advance the environmental agenda, who is going to take the lead on advancing the agenda that equally supports biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation and adaptation, or which scientific platform will be dedicated to assessing the evidence around nature-based solution in their implementation. Because the fact that you bring those two together creates things that none of that where you need expertise on both on climate and on biodiversity. And then there's no real clear major funding mechanism that unequivocally enables countries to choose to invest in projects that equally, again, support biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation and adaptation. And then there's the whole problem of the risk associated with pushing a biodiversity agenda in a climate forum. Now, it makes sense, but the problem is that the current focus on mitigation and adaptation the current focus on mitigation as opposed to adaptation and biodiversity. And that's because mitigation is much more easier somehow to conceptualize and track than adaptation benefits or biodiversity benefits. Means that unless safe, strong guards are in place, you really have a situation where a nature-based solution agenda could lead to greenwashing and potential negative impact on biodiversity. So I think many will agree that at COP26 will be a failure without radical plans to address our dependency on fossil fuels. We need to reduce emissions. We need to rapidly transition economies around the world to a sustainable low-carbon future. I would also argue that it will be a failure if there's no clear acknowledgement that to get out of the climate change emergency, we need to bend the curve on biodiversity loss and really rebuild our natural world. But here I really mean nature. I don't mean just tree. And that's this nature that needs to be at the heart of COP26. So it would be good that COP26 both think about vision and action that would create an enabling environment for effective solution to the crisis we are facing and the solution that could be developed and implemented, but also action that address the issues that create the problem to start with. So, for example, I think that COP26 need to think about emission for sure, but they also need to think about the substantial and chronic underfunding of global biodiversity conservation. They need to think about financial incentives that negatively impact biodiversity and or climate change. And they really need to do something about it. You can't give money to try to fix a problem and give even more money to continue to enhance the problem. And then you need to think about this enabling environment. So, for example, thinking about the higher level of integration, scientific and political, as well as social, on the biodiversity and the climate change agenda, but also thinking about environmental legislation that better support conservation in time of rapid climatic change. And that's, I come with a rewilding interest in mind. So we have been very good at thinking about conservation framework that aim to bring back what was there. We're not really good at thinking about legislation and an environment that that aimed to just increase biodiversity, whether or not it was there to start with. So this functional thinking as well as the composition thinking, because right now we are very much into a composition and a restoration approach, and not that much thinking that, well, things might not never come back to where they were in some places. So I hope that was useful, Idil.
Natalie, it was fantastic, and thank you for highlighting especially the challenges that we should be aware of as a community working on the alignment between biodiversity and climate change, especially moving to on the way to the COP26. The caution that you highlight about having the biodiversity agenda on in a climate environment. That's extremely valuable, and now I am going to invite everyone, all the speakers here. We have very brief time to discuss in light of the comments. I'm going to read out some of the comments that we have received, and I see a comment for Dr. McGregor that says, it is important to learn from indigenous approaches to biodiversity and to climate change, and to build them into policy and practice at all levels for local communities. And that need is recognized. Now, it's, for example, in platforms such as IPBES or CBD, but it needs to be more widespread. Do you have any thoughts, especially now as we prepare for COP26?
I think the engagement needs to be, for lack of a better word, meaningful, because I'm in spaces, climate change spaces, climate solution spaces, climate adaptation spaces, and the work that policy spaces and the work that I do. And there's some, acknowledgement of Indigenous knowledge. I'd say that's recognized, particularly in Canadian policy. But where people don't like to go is the history of colonization, the impact of that, and Emile talked about this, the food, water security, and also those aspects of addressing the biodiversity and climate change, because Indigenous people do see these as being linked, because you're literally living there and you're feeling this like every day in your everyday lived reality. Those are harder, like the linkages with language, linkages with revitalization. Those are harder to kind of, for people to wrap their heads around. Because a lot of solutions in Canada are very urban based, because that's where most of the people are. A lot of policy direction is based on data that currently exists. And again, Mel pointed this out, that it's because I'm on these committees like, why aren't we addressing Northern and Indigenous considerations? To go, we don't have the data. We don't have the information. So I think we need to really make that effective and meaningful. And Indigenous people is not just being at the table sitting there. Like you need to have your own knowledge to bring to the table, and a lot that funded and a lot of that work in order for it to be meaningful, and for people to be willing to talk about those kind of things, like the history of colonization and how that impacts people's ability to adapt and be resilient. Whereas in my experience, a lot of folk don't like to go there and don't know what to do with that. So maybe the Sustainable Development Goals can help do that. That's usually not in people's realm at the local level in these discussions. So making a lot of this accessible to local decision making is really important. So hopefully that was helpful. I'm trying to jam a lot out there, and knowing we're running out of time here, and there's other questions for other panelists. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. We can turn to other panelists, maybe. Ime, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I think I really enjoyed listening to all of you, and I wonder whether there is a process in Canada about localizing the SDGs at community level or urban level. We have that a lot in Germany and Europe, that cities actually and of different sizes, also very small ones, are trying to localize action in that sense. So whether I think that would be, and I also don't think that it is important that everyone knows the SDGs. I think it's just an instrument for structuring thinking a bit, but actually the starting point should be what people want for a good life in the future, how they imagine that. I think that is also what you were saying. And probably when communities start discussing that, they will end up with topics which we could then afterwards link with the SDGs. That's what I think, actually.
This is fantastic. Thank you, Ime. I'm going to ask that last question as a rejoinder both to William and Natalie. And in fact, I'm going to connect it to cities. Earlier today, we had a very interesting session on cities and nature. And Ime, you talked about today in the plenary about the interlinkages and network effects. So William, listening to your presentation about the oceans and how it relates also to health and to human well-being, I think there is a connector there with cities, because many urban centers are coastal. In fact, where you live is one. So can you share maybe some insights on that, and then we can connect it to rewilding, the rewilding work that Natalie can bring in to close. William, to you.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's very important point. I think most people may see that the oceans is remote to them if they are not living by the coast. But as you mentioned, the major populations are all along, mostly along the coast. And even people who are living inland are also tightly connected to the oceans as well. And one key example for that would really exemplify that linkage is through the food systems. And I think that's really a topical issue too with the World Food Summit that happened a few weeks ago, as well as the whole initiative to bring up the importance of blue food or aquatic food in trying to be part of the solution to address global food security issues, and that certainly would include the oceans as well. And the focus in here is that then it is to develop that sustainable food systems. So in this case, from the oceans that would also connect to basically everyone around the world, because that can be part of their food as well, with nutrient rich. And also for some communities, it will also means it's beyond food, the nutrients as well as the culture as well. And the idea would then to develop these future sustainable food system that connect that relate to the oceans, either from aquaculture or from capture fisheries or other means that would also address biodiversity issues, maybe also be part of the solutions as well as climate change challenges. And I think that's an example of how to bring these up, the connections between the oceans, people, and then also the importance of addressing biodiversity and climate change in a holistic way. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Natalie, very brief.
Yes, there is, the cities are an important place for starting to address the problem of coexistence between wildlife and humans. So in a lot of places, it's that lack of connection and that the problem of coexistence that is driving biodiversity loss. And not only because you have this idea that nature and wild is far away and is doing well because it's not connected to you, but you are creating a safe space where there's nothing that annoys you and you destroy whatever you can't cope with. By starting to bringing back the idea that we need to coexist and that you can't just get rid of things because you don't like them, but you have to think more as to how everything plays a part in a bigger machine that supports all of us. You are starting to address one of the main issues in conservation, which is that disconnection and that lack of understanding of how things connect together. And in that phase, the rewilding discussion, which are far from being straightforward, they are creating a lot of tension and actually alienation in many countries and in many cultures, because it doesn't relate to some of the issues that they are facing. But it's a healthy discussion to reposition humanity in the wild and in wildlife, with wildlife.
Absolutely. And thank you. As I look at the closing comments, in Canada, for example, there are both diversity and climate interactions, especially with Indigenous communities in all coasts. And but I'm also seeing a comment in the chat that the Indigenous perspectives are not adequately represented in the climate change space in the UNFCCC. So this is one thing that I think we should also be focusing on, and together with expanding the scope of climate action, because climate action has been very much focused in the climate change space. It's been very much focused on mitigation. Of course, that's extremely important, but the challenge and the task of expanding to adaptation, to biodiversity, to climate, nature, and people, this is now our task. And it is my great pleasure to thank everyone, thank our panelists, thank our participants, our team, our partners for this splendid knowledge exchange. I hope that you stay in touch with us, follow our side events. Several of us are going to be there also among our partners. And on this note, thank you. And until next time, be well.